Hello, this is Mr. Smith, and I'm here with the second lecture of Government 2 Politics in America, the Political Culture of the Country in the Academic Government and Economics class. Where we left off from the last lecture, I had talked about how the parties evolved, the dual party system, Republicans and Democrats, and what both those parties look like today. Today, of course, Republicans represent a conservative, small government, federalist based system, whereas the Democrats believe in a stronger central government and are more liberal. This is, of course, a change in the past since before the Great Depression, both those parties were flip flopped in different positions, so to speak. The political party organization is set up so that it has representatives at all levels. And here we can see the pyramid where local candidates and parties that exist, at least at the county level, have elections for their leadership. And so there is voter input, usually through the primary elections, into the delegates that represent the average party member on the county committees. And even at the local level, such as county and municipal elections, parties through the primary process get to choose candidates. Then there's, of course, the state committees, and they have a lot more power to influence the state legislature and also how elections are carried out and what kind of policies are implemented. State candidates are once again nominated through the same way through the state primary system. And then, of course, there are those at the federal level, including House and Senate members. Then there's the central committees, the DNC and RNC. They both are the bodies that lead the parties, headquartered in Washington, D.C. And then, of course, they have their executive national committees. The president of the United States is informally the head of the political party that they belong to. So if the president is a Republican, then they technically are at the same level as the national committee and even the chairperson, but usually the president is going to have the final say on everything. So if they're a Democrat, it would be the exact same thing. They have a national committee and a chairperson, but basically they're going to do whatever the president says if they're a member of the same party. At the local level, of course, states are divided into congressional districts based on their population. So, for instance, if a state has 18 congressional districts, the state is divided up into that on a map by the state legislature. And cities and districts are divided into wards usually. Titusville has multiple wards, for instance, whereas the other local boroughs might only have one, and townships might only have one as well. But they can also have different precincts where people can vote, and that's the smallest level, which are usually located in maybe an apartment building or a church or a fire hall, for instance. And that's where people typically go to cast their actual votes. Party conventions are the biggest meeting that happens. And on a national level, the Republican and Democratic parties meet during leap years, the same year a president is elected, and that's where they establish their party platform or their manifesto, what they hope to accomplish with public policy. These help rally people around certain ideas, but at the same time, they're often written in an extremely vague manner. So that way, the party doesn't necessarily have to be held responsible if their goals aren't achieved. The conventions also are where formally the delegates show up to choose the nominee for president of the United States. The delegates are determined by the primary vote in the spring in each of the states. And so, for instance, if most of those elections are proportional, and if, for instance, in Pennsylvania, somebody gets 60% of the primary vote, then they will get 60% of the delegates, and they show up and they cast their votes by state for president of the United States. One of the things that parties, of course, need to do in order to initiate their public policy beliefs into actual law is win elections. And they, of course, run candidates for office. Once somebody gets chosen as the nominee in the primary election, usually the party at the state level and national levels lends them support, maybe even campaign funds, and helps them make sure that they're on the general ballot in the fall. But they also use some other methods to do that. They send out mailings. They recruit volunteers to go door to door. They produce propaganda in advertisement form on social media and TV, and even in some print forms as well. And of course, they also try to make it so that they can win elections easier. One of the methods they use is called gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is named after the former governor of Massachusetts, Gerry, from the early republic. And he was governor when this method was first used. Whenever the census takes place every 10 years, then the following year, the state legislature gets to redraw the districts, because if you gain people, that means you need more representatives. And so you have to redraw the district boundaries to include a new district, for instance. And whenever you do that, you can draw the districts in such a way to benefit your party the most. So, for instance, if you have in this area, this entire area that I'm circling now, you have political party B with lots and lots of voters, especially in the middle section. What you can do is you can create a district that carves it up, so that way where that party B is heaviest right here in the center can get outvoted maybe by these outer areas where party A has more members. And so what you do is you try to block together as many people that you have in your party and maybe cut apart and decrease the number of voters that exist within another party. This is an old congressional district from Pennsylvania that was nicknamed Goofy Kicking Pluto. And there was actually a contest online where bizarrely drawn districts were nominated for nicknames. And some of them look even more ridiculous than this. And the problem is that these divide counties and municipalities. They lack a certain compactness. They're confusing to voters. People are often confused along these long borders, exactly where exactly they are. Are they in this district, or they are in a neighboring one? And not only that, you can see in part they're not even connected by that much. And so you end up with people that are very far away from each other. If the member of the house that gets elected lives here, they're incredibly far away from people that live on the outskirts of the other side of the district. And so some state Supreme Courts have ruled that these are unconstitutional according to their state legislation. And that's what happened in Pennsylvania. These districts were redrawn. They were made more compact. They split less counties, although that still has to happen in some cases. And what you ended up with is an even split. The next time there was a House election, you ended up with half of them being Democrats and half being Republicans. So many experts say that that is a fair system compared to using gerrymandering. And then, of course, there are minor parties in the United States. They can divide it up into four categories. Ideological parties have a specific philosophy. For instance, libertarians, which confusingly are called liberals in other countries, but libertarians believe in the smallest form of government possible. They believe in keeping police, in a small military to defend our borders, and not really much of anything else. They believe that laws that Republicans want, like laws against abortion and gay marriage, are bad. And they also believe that laws that Democrats want, like the minimum wage and pollution, are bad. And so they want minimal government. So because of that, they might sound good half the time to half the country, but in reality, they have at least some policies that everybody's not going to like. The Libertarian Party is one of the biggest ideological parties. Another one would be the Green Party, which believes in the ideology of protecting the environment and good allocation of resources and treating people fairly. The Single Issue Party is what the Greens used to be, because they used to only care about the environment. But as they've become bigger and they've been able to win elections in other countries, they've had to endorse other policies. So voting for the Green Party used to be just a single issue party, and they might still consider themselves to be that. However, another single issue party would be Prohibition Party. They were just in favor of getting rid of alcohol. That was their only issue. Economic protest parties, for instance, might represent the taxpayers or maybe businesses, and they concentrate on issues involving money in particular. And so they don't necessarily take a side on social issues like gay marriage or abortion. And then there's splinter parties. Whenever you have a large enough group of people that is upset with one of the two big parties, they might break off and nominate their own candidate. And a good example of that would be 1912 when Teddy Roosevelt couldn't secure the Republican nomination back away from President Taft, get it back for himself. And so he and his supporters split off and formed the Bull Moose or Progressive Party. Now, he did end up being one of the few minor candidates to ever win electoral votes. In fact, he came in second place in that election, which is amazing for a third party. But at the same time, it also guarantees that you'll split the big party that you started off with. And so it guaranteed, for instance, in that election that the Democrats would win. And then there's actual voting that takes place. There's two sets of elections: the primary election, which happens in the spring, and spring in politics lasts from January the whole way through September. Each state has it at a different time. And during this election, they get to choose whether or not they or who their candidates will be from office. So Republicans help choose which Republican candidates will be nominated, and Democrats help choose which Democratic candidates can be nominated. In Pennsylvania, we used a closed primary system, so Republicans can only vote in the nomination of Republican candidates, and Democrats can only vote in the nomination of Democratic candidates. And this is a picture from what would happen in a precinct. You walk in, there's a line, you go up to the counter, they have lists where they have the names of the precincts, you sign next to where your name is listed, and then you go into one of the booths, which is at the back of the room there. And in Pennsylvania and Crawford County in particular right now, you vote electronically by touchscreen. And then you get a ballot that is printed off from there, and you put it into a counting machine separately. So that way there's a paper trail as well as the electronic machines. Ways to nominate a committee or a candidate, they can announce themselves. They can participate in a caucus or a convention, which is a small meeting of people that can come together and nominate the person. They can go through a direct primary, and that's what the primary elections are, where you go before the people and you ask to be nominated by your parties. That way you can officially be on the fall ballot in the general election in November. Or you can get on by petition, and different states have different requirements onto getting onto the ballot. When the candidates are selected, they then are funneled into the general election, which happens on the first Tuesday after the first Monday of November. And let me repeat that again: the first Tuesday after the first November, or the first Monday in November. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that if Tuesday is the first day of the month, then it will not be on that day because it takes place on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November. So if Monday's the first day of the month, then the election will happen the next day on Tuesday. Types of primaries I already mentioned. Pennsylvania uses a closed primary, which you can see highlighted in yellow, which means you have to vote within your party, and unaffiliated voters, known as independents, are not permitted to vote. Other states have different methods, including an open public declaration, which means you have to declare which party you're going to be voting for in that nomination process. And then blanket primaries, which means anybody can vote anywhere, no matter what. And it's very similar to an open election. All of these different types of elections, obviously, as the map is colored differently. The states, of course, can change this whenever they want according to the state legislature, what exactly they want. And there's always debates about this. Is it better for the party to choose their own people? After all, it is their candidate. Or is it better that more people have a say in the election? Louisiana, by the way, is colored differently because it has kind of an odd primary system where everybody runs, everybody gets on the primary ballot by petitioning, and then whoever the top two vote getters are in the election move on to the general, no matter what. And then the ballots. This is what they can look like. They can list people, as you can see on the left-hand side, or they can list them by party and have the people underneath that. So there's an office group ballot and there's a party column ballot. The electronic voting process, there's a central control unit that exists within each of the county seats in Pennsylvania, for instance, and they're the ones that distribute the voting machines, and the cartridges or data banks that go along with them. So that's all done in one place, and it's not online because obviously if it was online, it could be hacked. Then they send blank ballots to the precinct, and then that gets sent to the voting booth through a touchpad, and then that goes back to the precinct control, which in Pennsylvania are these little kind of stations where you put your paper ballot into, so it records it, and then that gets sent back to the county seat. And then, of course, right now you can vote in person or you can vote by absentee ballot, which is if you just for that time, maybe you join the military, maybe your business, your job takes you away for that election only, so you vote by absentee ballot. Or you can choose to vote on a more permanent mail in ballot process. When that happens, you get sent the ballot with a specifically coded number that matches with your name. You fill it out, you sign it as you would on any official document. You fill out the various other parts of the ballot. Obviously, you're voting for someone, but also the other identification pieces. Then you put it in an envelope, which then goes into a second envelope. The second envelope is to stay on the outside so nobody can see what's on inside. Mail-in ballots, of course, do have some flaws with them. Obviously, it introduces another party, the post office, and so there's always the possibility that something could get lost. But even then, the error rate is still small, although it is slightly smaller for in-person voting. The candidates, of course, at various levels, but especially the presidency, can participate in a wide variety of campaign activities, fundraisers, parades, gatherings, rallies, but also debates that occur between the two candidates, or if there's a minor party candidate that's serious, maybe more. And then there's interest groups. Interest groups represent organizations or people that have something in common and have some type of interest in creating public policy. These groups are nonprofit organizations, but they raise enormous amounts of money that they can use to create their own propaganda, but also back candidates. 41% of interest groups are representing trade or businesses, individual businesses. 22% are representing trade, which are entire industries. 14% are representing citizen groups, 2% labor unions, 9% professional associations, and 12% others. So there might be a political action committee or interest group set up on behalf of a business, an actual company. There might be one representing all coal mines, which would be a trade association. There might be one representing firearms owners, like the National Rifle Association. That would be a citizen group. There might be one representing electrician workers, which would be a union. And there might be one representing, for instance, doctors, the American Medical Association, which is a professional association. All these would be examples of interest groups. Their growth has been considerable as more and more people become organized behind their preferred issues that they want to champion and perhaps establish new policy or law on in their state or national legislature. There you can see corporate ones make up the largest amount, then followed by labor when it comes to the growth and number of these interest groups. And then non-connected would be the lowest. This, of course, is from the 70s to the 90s, and that started to stabilize. Membership in labor unions, though, has gone down. And here you can see it's gone down below 15% by 2000. It actually has fallen below 10%. So workers don't have as much influence as in the past, but businesses, as you saw that corporate one in the previous graph, is quite high. So some people point out that's the unfairness that businesses and trade organizations have a lot more representation in interest groups than the average worker. And interest groups in turn can influence media. Like I said, they produce propaganda and can provide certain opinions for journalist stories about what governing is all about. And the interest groups hire specific people called lobbyists to go and visit with journalists, to go and visit with congressmen, to go and visit with their state legislators to explain their position. Lobbyists, of course, are sometimes seen as having too cozy of a relationship with politicians. They tell them, hey, let's discuss this law over dinner tonight at a fancy restaurant, or maybe take you on this trip, this ski trip, and show you what exactly I mean about this new policy I want enacted. And so lobbyists have a negative perception, and some people look at it as a way of legally bribing officials and cozying too much up to journalists. And speaking of the media, access to media is very large in the United States. You can see television sets per 1,000 persons is at 776, which is the largest in this list. radios. People still listen to the radio, and there's over 2,000 per 1,000 persons, which means everybody has access to more than one radio. And daily newspaper circulation, as you can see, has actually gone down, and it continues to do so as people turn more for their reading to social media and the internet in particular. And of course, the media does have bias. The biggest bias that the media has is making money. They obviously need to sell advertisements, they need to sell subscriptions. And so that is their biggest bias. The next sort of bias would be political bias. And here you can see that there's various organizations spread throughout the political spectrum. Right in the middle would be the most neutral organizations like AP or Reuters or NPR. And then those on the left-hand side are more biased toward Democrats or the liberal point of view, like Mother Jones, for instance, or the New Republic or Daily Kos. And then those on the right are more biased toward Republicans or conservatives, and that include the Washington Times, the Judge Report, Fox News, and so on. There at the far side are those that are so biased that they even favor conspiracy theories that make the opposite side look bad, which you can see Patriobotics and InfoWars on the extremes of the spectrum. Then you can see CNN, which is one of the most major news sources, is a little bit to the left. The Inquirer is almost in the middle because they print tabloid stories and they don't care if they expose a Republican or a Democrat's secret affair on the side, so they're more neutral than anything else. But of course, media has been changing. It used to be mostly newspaper-based. Even in the 19th century, the 1800s, both Republicans and Democrats started newspapers to push their point of view. So newspapers have been around and they were bigger in the past, and they also have been biased throughout their entire history. And so people are sometimes surprised today, oh, I can't believe this news source is biased. But that's been going on for a long time. People started newspapers for specific political topics. Abolitionists, for instance, started newspapers just to advocate getting rid of slavery. And so media has had a bias for quite a considerable period of time. The expectation, though, as journalism became more professional and educated with certain classes and expertise they had to gather by going to university, for instance, that they would become more merit-based, more neutral. And so when one of them today does come out and say something opinionated, people become offended because it's been expected that they would today conform to some type of neutrality. Newspapers, of course, has been going down. They started to get competition with the radio in the 1920s and 30s, but that wasn't the big killer. Neither was television when it became more and more affordable and introduced into people's homes in the 50s and 60s. Eventually, though, the internet is what did the newspapers in, and many newspapers have tried to conform by converting to websites, by either selling advertisements or subscriptions, although many people, of course, are unwilling to do that because you can get your news basically for free from other places in social media or the internet. This, of course, has also created a problem because just about anybody can publish things on the internet or social media, even if it's completely untrue. So bias isn't the biggest problem, it's false information. And while the phrase fake news goes on, it really isn't the media news stations that produce the fakest news. It's usually individuals that do that, especially when they share information or repost without checking out if the information is accurate, because a lot of people don't care if it's accurate. And Facebook has been one of the ways of introducing a lot of false information and is heavily influenced by outside countries like Russia and China and Iran and North Korea that post all kinds of fake news stories through fake accounts. They create imaginary people that are supposedly Americans, and then they post all kinds of fake news stories about people that they don't want to see succeed, officials, government officials that they believe will be hard on their countries. And so Facebook, of course, supports complete freedom of speech, so it has been hesitant about getting rid of some of that. And when they do try to get rid of some of the fake information, they get accused of being biased only against certain individuals. So it's kind of a lose-lose situation for them. Then, of course, one of the biggest part of political activity is our individual actions within our local communities, and that involves a certain civic mindedness. And here you can see a posting, and there's one of these similar types of signs on the outsides of Titusville on the outskirts, including civic or community service-based organizations like the Lions Club, the Kiwanis, the Rotary. Those are all organizations that adults belong to in order to contribute to community service. But community service is one of the voluntary things you can help in order to become a better citizen. There's also voluntary things you can do when it comes to politics, which includes voting. It's not mandatory in the United States. And also working for campaigns and raising money, volunteering, going door to door, offering people rides to go get to vote. Those are all parts of voluntary citizenship. Mandatory parts of citizenship, of course, include paying your taxes, serving on juries, signing up for the selective service so you're available in case there's a draft. Those would all be examples of mandatory aspects of citizenship. Two great examples of honorable citizens would be George Washington and Martin Luther King Jr. George Washington was a hero to Americans. He led the Continental Army, and he didn't win a lot of battles, but he won the right ones, and he knew when to retreat when necessary, so that the Continental Army, was never destroyed by the British. But because of that heroism, he easily could have asked to be appointed permanent ruler of the American states, and many people probably would agree with it. But he decided to retire from military life and go back to his farm in Mount Vernon. And then when the presidency was created, and he was part of that at the Constitutional Convention, it was basically created around him, assuming that he would become the first president, and that's exactly what happened. And at the end of 2 terms, at the time when the country was first created, there was no presidential term limit. That wouldn't be established until the 22nd Amendment in the 20th century. And so he could have run for a 3rd term, but he decided not to because he believed staying in office too long would make people too powerful, so he again decided to retire. Then there's Martin Luther King Jr., who advocated against the Jim Crow laws of the South in particular that segregated those of African descent from the people of European descent in the population. And he advocated for civil disobedience, peaceful protests, marches, sit-ins, boycotts, all kinds of things that would convince the voters in the South, but also the North, to put pressure on elected officials in order to get rid of the segregation system. Both of these are good examples of citizens. And then, of course, average people can participate in grassroots efforts such as protests, marches. This goes the whole way back to the Revolutionary period, when Americans boycotted and wrote letters and published newspapers in order to advocate patriotism and separating from England. Sometimes they can get carried away. For instance, during the Revolutionary period, there are riots known as the Stamp Act riots, protesting against the stamp you had to get to prove that you paid tax on paper. People attacked government officials. They tried to fetter them, beat them up, burned down government buildings, for instance, and the private property of British companies. And so sometimes these efforts grow into riots, and of course, the right thing to do is to stay peaceful and respect other people's property and opinions in the process. Whenever parades do take place or marches like this, you just simply need to go through the local police department or whatever other government organization your local municipality has in order to get a parade permit, so that way you can have a march like this. Because after all, we have to know when the streets need to be shut down for these types of events. But these are the things that make up political culture, political parties, elections, the interest groups, the media, and civic mindedness.